All right, in this video, I am going to show you a couple of things. I'm hoping it won't be too long, but feel free to, pause and break it up for yourself. The first thing I'm going to show you is how I do a UPSCheck box with my students. Then I'm going to show you how I do totals and labels. Then 2 example problems showing you how that actually looks with a word problem. And then finally I'll end with talking about my progression of, which activities come first. This is definitely something that is a process. It takes a very long time. It is not something that you just teach one day and the kids know how to do it. It usually takes about the first 6 weeks to really model it very well for students to start being able to use it completely on their own after that. So this is a UPSCheck box. It is just a 4 square grid, 2 by 2. So U stands for understand, P is plan, S is solve, and check is check for reasonableness. I'm sure that most of you, if you have been teaching your students any kind of strategies for word problems, you've done all of these. It just may not have been called UPSCheck. So in the U, there are definitely 4 things that are very important that students need to write down. And one thing that is kind of hard at first is for students to understand you're not rewriting the entire question in the U, because some students want to do that. So I really have to kind of slow down and say, okay, let's just look at the first sentence. What do we need from the first sentence in the U? We're not writing the whole sentence, but what is the important part about that sentence? And then, continue on with the next sentence and so on. So, of course, they need all the numbers, but specifically with the labels. So if you see a number like 15, don't just write 15. That's super important. You must have the label. That's one thing that I noticed, that when students come into 5th grade, they might be real quick about writing the number. Oh yeah, I need that number. And they can tell me they need that number, but they don't write the label. And a lot of times when I ask them, what's the label? It's very difficult for them to tell me that. So that's something we really have to work on. So definitely the number with the label. Okay, so what I mean by label is if the question is saying I have 15 cats and 15 dogs, cats and dogs are the labels. Okay, so of course keywords, I always want children to write down keywords, but I don't want them to only be focused on keywords. What I teach my children is to use keywords not as the very first thing they look at to tell what they need to do, but as a, let's just look and see if these keywords support the work that I've done. And of course, vocabulary, any kind of vocabulary words that might help them understand and solve the problems. And then part of the question, not the whole question, just part of it, just something that is the main idea of that question that tells me what I need to do. And so, like I said, the understand part is sometimes a little difficult. We have to model that a lot because they want to just rewrite the whole question, but we're not rewriting. We're just picking out those key things that we need. So after they understand what they need to do, the next part is to make their plan. Okay. And so for the plan, there are 2 things you're going to look at, okay? Because as we know in math, it's not always an operation, okay? Most of the time, there's an operation, okay? So if I need to add, subtract, multiply, or divide, then I am going to do my totals and labels, excuse me, and that I'm going to talk to you about just next, okay? So I'm going to skip that part for a second. Okay, so if I know there's an operation, then I do my totals and labels. If there's no operation, then I want to write down the main idea. Okay, for instance, especially in 5th grade, I don't know how your personal financial literacy unit is, but the majority of our personal financial literacy unit really is about definitions. Okay, so they might read the word problem and say, you know what, I need to know the definition for taxes. Okay, so it's a question that is pretty much just saying, you know, here's a situation, which one of these taxes does that cover? And so really they just need to know the definitions. So it's okay to just write a main idea. Perhaps it's a graphing question where they have to actually graph, or they have to look and find the point that is being graphed. Okay, so it doesn't have to be like a big long sentence. It doesn't have to be, I mean, really just a couple of words in here if there's not an operation. Okay, and like I said, if there is an operation, I'll show you the totals and labels in just a minute. Okay, then the S is obviously for the solution part. That's where they're going to do the work. And what I teach my students is whatever you say up here on the plan that you're going to do has to match your solution. You can't say up here that you're going to do one thing and then do something completely different down here. So if you're telling me that you need the definition of taxes, then down here I should see, okay, payroll tax, income tax, and so on, and I should see those actual definitions. Okay, that is the work right there. If I'm saying that I'm going to add here in my plan, then I need to see some addition. I can't say I'm going to add and then do subtraction. Those go hand in hand. You must have the same thing that you said you were going to do. And this last one is usually the box that is the hardest, okay, for the kids to do on their own. And it takes a lot of talking to them about what does it mean when I say reasonable. Okay, now I don't know about you guys, but I have my students estimate everything. If there is an operation, they are estimating. I do not teach estimation, solely on its own. Like I know each of our units, usually will start with a lesson. Oh, here's how you estimate adding and subtracting fractions. Well, that's great. And I do that lesson, but I then have my students estimate all the time. And they hear this word multiple times a day, reasonable. And we talk about when we have our different types of numbers and even our different, place values. What's reasonable when I'm talking about a tens place? What's reasonable when I'm talking about multiplying into the hundredths place, and so on. So we have those discussions all the time. So they know that to check for reasonableness basically means, does it make sense? Okay, does the answer that I got make sense with the things that I pulled out for the understand? Does it make sense with my plan? Okay, and does whatever strategy I do here in this box make sense with what I did over here? So here are some things that they can do to check for reasonableness. Almost all of us teach inverse operation. Okay, so if you're adding over here, you can subtract. Okay, a lot of them, they can tell me that real quick. So I know that there's a lot of that happening in 3rd and 4th grade because I barely ever have to teach that. I might have to teach them what that looks like with 5th grade numbers, but as far as them knowing that, they can tell me that. So you guys are doing a really great job with that part. They can also do a different strategy. Okay, so for instance, let's say I am multiplying. Okay, there are many multiplication strategies. So let's say over here for the solve part, I decide to use my partial products or box method for multiplying. Okay, so 20 plus 8 and 10 plus 7 is 28 times 17. So I'm using my box method, my partial products over here. Okay, well, let's say over here, I then want to do the standard algorithm. Okay, now normally that is the other way around. They will like to do standard algorithm over here and then do the box method, but it honestly doesn't matter. So if they do one strategy here, they can do another one on this side. They can also do the same strategy. Okay, I teach them that if you do one strategy over here and you do the same strategy over here and you get the same answer, that can help you see if that answer is reasonable. Okay, but I also teach them these other ways, because what if you did it wrong both in the solve and the check for reasonableness? And you don't know that because you've got the same answer. So doing the same strategy is kind of like, I don't want it to be the default. I'd really rather they do inverse operation or a different strategy or estimating. But if they're completely just confused on what they should do, they can do the same strategy again. Okay. And as I said, we estimate everything. And I mean everything. If it has an operation, we estimate. So if the problem over here is 28 times 17, then over here we are estimating that by rounding to the nearest tens place, because that is the greatest place value in common. And so we would round that. And then I also teach my students about under and overestimate. And that is another thing that they get really well versed at. So my students could tell me that this 600 has to be an overestimate because both of these factors were rounded up. And so that also helps. They can look at their answer over here in the solve and say, okay, is that close to 600? Yes, so it makes sense, so that's reasonable. But then they can also say, but I know 600 is greater because that's an overestimate. So is my answer less than 600? And then that's another way to say, yes, so it's less than 600, but it's also close to 600, so it makes more sense. And then finally, a why statement. Now this is a lot for if you have a no operation question, for instance, if you're doing definition of taxes, a why statement is basically, I chose A because blank. And it has to be, a thought-provoking sentence. It's not just, I chose B because it was the best answer. Or I chose B because I like that answer. That's not telling me what they were thinking. And so I teach them, your why statement always has to tell me what you're thinking. So I chose B because that is the definition of payroll tax. Well, okay, that's a good statement because that tells me you chose that because that's the definition. And then I, as a teacher, can say to myself, well, did they get the right answer? If they did, then that means they know that definition. If they didn't get the right answer, but they said that they picked it because that's the definition, then really they don't know that definition, and we have to go back to that question again, or to those words. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is totals and labels. This is sometimes hard for some students, but usually there's that aha moment when it starts to click. And usually, the first few kids start getting it pretty much right away. And then, most kids maybe about 2 weeks in, and it's just something that we continue to talk about all the time and do with every operation type problem. This, I tell the kids all the time, is a way for you to know what operation to do without, you'll never have to guess again. Okay, if you can do totals and labels, that will tell you exactly what operation to do. Okay, so this I tie in with strip diagrams all the time. Okay, so if I have a problem and it says I have 28 cats and I have 35 dogs, and my question is asking me how many animals do I have? Like this, then what that's telling me is I do not know my total, because my total would be up here for my strip diagram. So if I do not know, that means I need to find my total. So the options for finding the total are adding or multiplying. If I already know the total, let's say now I know that there are 72 animals, and I know that there are 28 cats, but I don't know how many dogs there are, then that is an example of I know my total. So if I know my total, I subtract or divide. And the way I normally have the kids write this out is we write a T, and then we talk about, do I know my total or am I trying to find it? And so let's say I know my total, I would just write it like this. Okay, or I'd write T is add or multiply. So again, we have to discuss it and tie it into strip diagrams. Okay, just like with the estimating, I estimate with everything with the kids. We do a lot of strip diagrams to help them understand the part-whole relationships, not just with our word problems here, but with everything. So then the next thing to talk about is your labels. Okay, if you have the same labels, your options are to add or subtract. Okay, so for instance, if I have 28 cats and I have 4 bowls, those are different labels. Okay, and the way I teach this is, can I add cats and bowls together? Does that make sense? And they say, no, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, could I add cats and cats? Absolutely. Could I add bowls and bowls? Absolutely. If I have the same labels, I add or subtract. And again, I write it like this. So L, add or subtract. If I have different labels like this, okay, if I'm talking about I have 28 cats and there are four bowls, I can say how many cats eat out of the same bowl. Well, that is a division problem. Okay, and so if the labels are different, I multiply or divide. So it would look like this. Okay, so what I tell the kids is, for every operation problem, we will have one of these for my total and one of these for my label. So let's look at this problem up here. Okay, I know that I do not have my total, so I need to find it. So that means add or multiply. Those are my only two options for that total. So then I'm looking at my labels. Cats and dogs. Now, here's where it might get slightly tricky, because the overall main idea of this question is talking about animals, and cats and dogs are both animals. So technically this cats and dogs would be the same label. Okay? And what I tell the kids is, think about that as, can I divide cats and dogs? Like, can I divide cats by dogs? Can I multiply cats times dogs? No, that doesn't really make sense. But could I add cats and dogs together? Yeah, I could have a context for that, and especially when they're asking me how many animals. So I would say that this label is actually the same. So if my labels are the same, I add or subtract. So at this point, what they do is they find the operation that is the same in both the total and the label, and so that is the operation that they do. So now I'm going to use this one. Okay, so I know my total is 72 animals. So if I know the total, I add or multiply. My labels are different. Cats and dogs, except here we go again with that idea of, but they're all animals, right? So I would say that they're the same labels, so I add or subtract. Oh my. What am I doing there? See, even I get screwed up on this sometimes, and the kids will catch me. Kids will catch me every time, and they'll say, that doesn't make sense, and we'll have to go over it again. But okay, so I do know my total. So if I know my total, see, that's my problem. I didn't pay attention. I know my total. So if I know my total, I have to subtract or divide. And I will do this. Sometimes I'll do that actually on purpose. I'll be honest, I didn't this time. I just wasn't paying attention. But sometimes I will do that on purpose because then I want the kids to catch me and I want them to be able to do that for themselves. So subtract or divide because I know my total. Okay, and again, the labels are the same because of the context of this problem. So now I know that I'm going to subtract. I know that this video is getting kind of long, but these concepts are things that literally take weeks to teach. And so, I feel like these are the super important parts that you need to see. So the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you some example problems, okay, of what a UPSCheck box would look like, including the totals and labels. So for this problem, for the U, for the understanding, I need to look, I'm going to look first at the first sentence. I don't need the name unless there's multiple names. What I need here is 28 miles on Sunday, and I need 45 miles on Wednesday. In the question, again, this is where kids start thinking, oh, they have to rewrite the whole entire question. No, you don't. Okay. What I would teach them is to say how many miles. And some of them might want to include in all, and I would be okay with that. So over here for the plan, I want to do my totals and labels. Okay. So I'm thinking about my total first. Well, I know that there's 2 parts there. I know that on Sunday there was 28 miles, and I know on Wednesday there was 45 miles, but what I don't know is that total. So that means if I don't know the total, I'm going to add or multiply. Then for my labels, I have miles and miles. So those are the same labels. If I'm going to have the same labels, I either add or subtract. So for this question, I know I need to add. So down here, remember I have to do whatever I said I was going to do in the plan. So I add my 28 and 45. Notice I'm labeling everything. Always, 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 we need to get our kids used to labeling everything. So then I just add them up, and now I have 73 miles. So here I need to decide what I want to do in order to check for reasonableness. Okay, perhaps I want to estimate 45. Okay, and so the highest place value in common is the tens place. So I'm going to round 28 to 30. And I'm going to round 45 to 50, and I add them together, and I get 80. Okay, is 80 close to 73? Yeah, it's relatively close, and I can see that I rounded both of my add-ins up, and since they were both rounded up, this is an overestimate. So 73 has to not only be close to 80, but it has to be less than 80 because 80 was an overestimate. And of course they could do the opposite operation and they could subtract and get their original add-in right there. Okay, so multiple ways that they can check for reasonableness here. Here's another example problem of UPSCheck. Okay, so for this problem, we're talking about Skittles. And so again, I want to go just sentence by sentence. So looking at the first sentence, all I need from this is 318 Skittles. Okay, she is making bags of Skittles for a party. That's good context, but not necessarily something I need to put down here in this box. Now, each is definitely a key word. So each bag will have 25 25 Skittles. Okay. I want to know how many full bags I will get. Okay. So I need to think about my plan, my totals and labels. Okay, so I know that I have 318 Skittles. I know that I'm going to have bags, and that each bag should have 25 Skittles. What I don't know is how many bags I'm going to get. So that tells me that I do know my total, and if I know my total, I'm going to subtract or divide. So next I look at my labels. I have Skittles, but this is total Skittles. Okay, this is Skittles, but this is 25 Skittles in each bag. Okay, which again, that can be a little tricky when we're talking about labels. So we really have to, draw a strip diagram, or we have to even just draw a picture to help the kids understand. Sometimes those labels can be a little tricky because these labels are different. So it's total Skittles and Skittles per bag. Okay, so that means that I'm going to either multiply or divide. Okay, so that means I will divide because that's what's in both of them. All right, so I'm not going to do the actual division. Quite frankly, I'm a little bit lazy this morning, plus I have 5 more videos to do after this. So I'm just going to say it's 7, remainder 8. Okay, and so then over here, I need to find some way to check for reasonableness. I can do that by estimating. Okay. A lot of my kids don't like estimating with division. I make them do it, but they don't like it. So they probably wouldn't choose that. They probably would just choose to do the inverse operation and multiply and then add those 8 back in. Okay. So those are some examples that might be helpful for you. Okay, so lastly, this is the progression of how I teach all of these things. So for the first week, when we're setting up our notebooks, I always give students a paper copy that they glue into their notebook that has the UPSCheck. And then we write down all of those things that you saw at the beginning. So in the U is the vocabulary and the part of the question and so on. So that way they always have something to refer back to. Then every day for really the next few weeks, when we're doing any type of word problem, I have them take that out and we go through those steps one at a time together. After I talk about UPSCheck, I always go back to strip diagrams. And again, same with me doing estimating. I estimate with everything with the kids. We refer back to strip diagrams all the time. But I do an actual lesson just on strip diagrams and what they look like so that they have those in their notes. Then I go to totals and labels. But for that, I use numberless problems. Okay, that way they don't get bogged down in the numbers and what do I need to do with the numbers, because we don't care about the numbers for that lesson. For that lesson, we only care about what would the totals be and what would the labels be, and really diving deep into those word problems to discover what those would be. Obviously, for the first 6 weeks especially, I model everything. Okay, we take time, normally once I get my challenge questions up and running, they take less than 5 minutes to do the whole thing. But at first it takes about 10 or 15 minutes, just because you really want to go in depth and you want to make sure that they're starting to really understand it before you move on. So then starting in the second 6 weeks, by that time they have done enough that they should be able to do some on their own. And so I do start sending that home for homework, and I'll do various different things. Sometimes I will give them a numberless problem so that they can show me what that would look like with UPSCheck, but then not actually have to solve it. Sometimes I will give them the word problem and I'll tell them what the answer is, but then they have to do the UPS check to prove that answer. Other times I will fill out part of it, and it'll be random, like, oh, today I'm going to put the check for reasonableness, but you have to do everything else. And then I also do it for a challenge question. So every day when we have a challenge question at the beginning of class, they have to do UPS check. They do not have a choice. So that I know that every day they are practicing UPS check at least once. We may not have any other word problems for the rest of that class period, but I know that they've done it at least once. They've done it on their own, and then after they do that, I go over it with them. So they're seeing it every day. And then I also tell them that when they are taking a test, this is supposed to be a tool that is helpful to them. This is not I'm going to beat you over the head and every single one of those questions you need to use UPS check, because they don't really need to do that. So I teach them you use UPS check when there's a question that's really hard or that you just don't know how to show your work. Okay, so if you read that question and you immediately know that it needs to be addition, then do your work for that. I'm okay with that. But if you read the question and you say to yourself, man, I don't know for sure what I'm supposed to be doing here, that is when you do your UPS check. Also, if you have those questions, like especially those questions that do not have an operation, and you're like, well, what am I supposed to do to show work for this question? If you don't know, then you need to do a UPS check, and that qualifies as work for me. I hope this was helpful. I know that's a lot of information given out to you. If you have questions, please just ask. I'll be happy to help you. This might be something that we need to have a little bit more training on at some point, but I'm really hopeful that that was helpful to you guys. And I'm always here for any questions you might have.